Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com/DanielSchiffer and use code DanielSchiffer to get 10% off your first purchase. A little over a week ago, I put up this video on my channel covering 8 tips for shooting better videos in low light. A lot of you really enjoyed the opening sequence to that tutorial, especially this part here where I had a clip of my buddy Pat Greenall sitting in the middle of the street, and then that transitioned into this clip of Alli standing next to this building. I got a ton of messages from people asking how I did this transition and also what did I do to make these clips look so smooth. So I've decided that today I'm gonna walk you through the editing process of those 2 clips, but before we get into that, I quickly wanna show you the raw footage so you can get an idea of what I started out with. All right, let's go, bud. Let's go. Good? Ready? Alright, so clearly there's nothing too special or complicated going on with these 2 shots. The first one, I had my camera on the gimbal in inverted mode, and I just walked across the street while articulating around my subject, trying to keep him in the center of the frame. Now with the second clip, I also had the camera on the gimbal, but I started nice and close to JR and then pulled away until you could no longer see him and he was out of focus. Now before we actually get into the editing process of these clips, there's a couple of things I want to point out that really help with the effectiveness and seamlessness of the transition. So the first thing I want to bring your attention to is that the same background is in both shots. You can see here in the back of our first shot you have the bank, and then in our second shot it's the same building behind JR. So to pull off an effect or transition like this one, you don't necessarily have to have the same background in both clips, but it did help in this case to give these 2 shots that sort of one take style effect. So the next thing I wanted to bring your attention to is that this second shot here was shot purposely with the intention of reversing the clip in post. So what I did was I started with the camera nice and close to JR, using manual focus to make sure that his face is perfectly tack sharp and in focus. That way, once I reverse the clip and JR comes into the frame, I knew I wouldn't miss my focus and he'd be completely sharp, exactly how I wanted it. So now let's move on to actually editing this transition. So my footage here is shot in 120 frames per second, which means I can highlight all of it and slow it down to 20% of its original speed. I'll go ahead and remove volume from both clips so that we're not hearing the in-camera audio. And the next thing I'm gonna do is use the blade tool to cut out the parts of the clips that I don't want. As you can see, I've already put markers on my clips to save us time. So I'm just gonna go ahead and make some cuts and then remove the parts of the clips that we don't need. So now it's time to start speed ramping our first clip. Starting at the beginning of the clip and scrubbing through, I'm gonna try and find the point where I want the shot to slow down. I think right around there looks pretty good, so I'm going to hit Shift B on our keyboard, making sure that the clip is selected, and then I'm going to speed up this first portion by 8 times. So I'm going to repeat this process one more time, only this time I'm going to decide where I want the clip to speed back up. So I'm gonna hit play, and I think right there I already want it to start speeding back up again, so I'm gonna hit Shift B and multiply this by 8 times its original speed. So you can use these here to adjust how smooth your speed ramp transition is, and I'm just gonna play around with this until I'm happy with how it looks. Okay, so after a little bit of tweaking, here is what the speed ramp looks like on our first clip. So now we can start working on our second shot, and the first thing I wanna do is reverse the clip. So I'm gonna go ahead and start scrubbing through until I find the point where I want our speed up to end and I want the shot to slow down. So I think right around there looks pretty good, so I'm gonna select our clip and hit Shift B, and then speed up this first portion by 8 times. And again, we're gonna make a few adjustments until we're happy with how it looks. So after a little bit of tweaking, I'm pretty much happy with how this speed ramp is looking. I actually changed the beginning part of our second clip to be reverse fast 4000% rather than 800%. I felt it looked a little bit better for the shot to come in even faster, and if we play it out, it looks like this. Alright, so far this is looking pretty good. You could actually keep this as a speed ramp transition and I think it would do just fine, but I want that really seamless, smooth look, so I'm gonna show you a couple of techniques that I use to pull that off. So the first little trick I had up my sleeve are these smooth transition layers from Ryan Nangle. Now they work pretty much the same as standard transitions, only they go above your clips and not directly on them. That way whatever effects or speed ramping or things you do to your clips is not going to be affected by these transitions. You can still edit your clips directly. In Final Cut, it can be tricky at times using the stock transitions that come with it. So doing it in these transition layers can actually be really helpful. So what I did was I took this zoom in 1 transition and placed it at the end of our first clip, and then I took in the zoom in 2 transition and placed it at the start of our second clip. Now if I scrub through these transitions frame by frame, you'll see that it does start to zoom into our first clip and then into our second clip as well. So with our first clip, I actually want to increase the amount of zoom. I feel like it's not strong enough. And with our second clip here, it's actually starting to get a little funky around the edges, so I want to reduce the amount of zoom there. So what I'm going to do is click on our first zoom in layer and make sure it's selected, and I'm going to go to the parameters and increase our zoom amount all the way to 100. Now I'm going to move over to our next clip and make sure that our second zoom in layer is selected, and I'm going to decrease the zoom amount to about 10. So here is what our transition looked like before we added the zoom in transition layers. And here's what the transition now looks like after we've added the zoom in effect. So hopefully you can tell that adding the zoom in transition did actually enhance the clip and it didn't take away from it. I think a lot of the time zoom in transitions can be overused, but in this particular scenario, I think it is a tasteful way to sort of tie the 2 clips into one another, and I think it also just enhances the speed ramp that we already did. So you could actually leave the transition like this and it would look pretty good, but I do have one more trick up my sleeve for really making the whole thing look smooth and seamless. So over here I have these motion blur adjustment layers, which I actually picked up from Mark Webster, who's another creator here on YouTube, and these motion blur layers do add a really good motion blur effect, but you should be careful if you don't have a powerful computer because they do slow down your computer a lot. And my computer does have pretty good specs, but even still my Final Cut does tend to crash once in a while when I use these. So just be careful with how much you're using them, and if you are going to use them, I recommend only applying them at the end of your edit once you've finished everything else. So what I'll do is I'll grab this MW Motion Blur 5 and drag it over top of my clip. And now I'm just gonna cut out the parts of the motion blur I don't want, making sure that it's only over top of the parts that have a speed ramp or a transition. So here is what our transition looks like with the speed ramp and the zoom in. And here is what the transition looks like with the speed ramp, the zoom in, and the motion blur applied. So as you could probably tell, the motion blur really does a good job of tying the clips together and making the speed ramps and the transitions look a lot smoother. So here is our final transition fully edited. Down below we have our sound design, which includes some sound effects, some background noise, as well as a couple of whooshes for those speed ramps. And up above here, you can see we've added this adjustment layer, which contains our letterbox, aka those widescreen cinematic bars at the top and bottom of our frame. I've also added a text layer, which is these question marks above Pat's head, because really, what on earth are you doing meditating in the middle of downtown Toronto on the street? And then obviously we have our color grade applied to both clips, which for that I just used my vintage look LUT pack, which you can check out down below. And with all of that done, let's take a look at a little comparison. So here is the transition with only the speed ramp. And here is the same transition with the color grade, with the motion blur, with the zoom in effect, with the text, with the cinematic bars, and with the sound effects, everything applied. It looks like this. So this is actually one of the sequences that I've made lately that I'm more proud of, and I definitely want to showcase it on my portfolio. Personally, I've been using Squarespace to build all of my websites for a few years now, and they also happen to be the sponsor of today's video. My website is filmer.ca, that's filmer without the E, and customizing your Squarespace website is extremely straightforward, and as you can see, I can instantly add the video to my portfolio by copying and pasting the YouTube link. And one of the things I love most about Squarespace is that they have tons of templates to choose from. So if you're a filmmaker or a photographer, a musician, a designer, or if you have a restaurant or any other business, Squarespace has you covered because they have so many options and layouts. And right now, Squarespace is offering all of my viewers 10% off their first purchase, so go to squarespace.com/Daniel Schiffer and use the code Daniel Schiffer and start your free trial today. So that is it for today's tutorial. Thank you guys so much for watching. Follow me on Instagram at Daniel.Schiffer, and as always, I will see you guys in the next video. Peace!